Egypt, when we took the Philadelphia corridor, the Egyptian high command was very upset because a lot of the corrupt money that comes through Gaza from the Qataris gets to the Egyptian officers, and they didn't want us to stop their smuggling operations to Hamas. And so, they joined the genocide case of South Africa at the ICJ. Egypt didn't think there was a genocide until it was costing Egyptian officials cash. Then they thought there was a genocide. B, they shut down the Rafah border crossing to aid at a time when it was the main aid crossing. In other words, in the view of the Arab world, and nobody cared in the Middle East, to everyone this made sense, you punish Palestinians by limiting aid as a way of punishing these. How do you punish Israelis? By punishing Palestinians. Nobody is curious about these dynamics. Now, we might be monsters, okay? I constantly complain in Hebrew about Israel, where it matters. It doesn't so much matter in English. There's plenty of people doing it. But the uncuriosity, to me, is the heart of the matter. And so your academia is no longer academic on these questions. It's no longer an academia. It's doing something else. There's some other function. American Jews willfully disarmed themselves of their own story, and now face a frontal assault on their story, and don't understand why they're so weak.
Part of what's been happening over in America, as you know, is that college kids care a lot about this issue. Among all the wars that are going on and have gone on. I graduated from Columbia 4 years ago, and I have a pretty good finger on the pulse of what kids are like and what they care about and what they believe and why. And my view is that intersectionality is the reigning philosophy when kids at a place like Columbia think about right and wrong in the world. And it basically goes white bad, black or of color good, male bad, female good, and on and on and on. And when they see Israel-Palestine, they think they are seeing an example of white people oppressing brown people. And that is the real reason they care so much about the issue. And so, one can call that anti-Semitism, but to me that seems a kind of imprecise way of talking about it, because the same kids would never really be caught, speaking ill of Jews in any other context. And like in 4 years at Columbia, I never heard an offhand comment about Jews, but every week I heard people talking about white men, right? And so they think the Israel issue is a special case of white people, is simply an example of white people oppressing brown people. And a hypothetical I think of and would like you to comment on is, if you imagine somehow a situation, and just forgive me, just don't imagine why it's this way, just accept the hypothetical. If it were only Mizrahi Jews that were visually, indistinguishable from Palestinians that populated Israel, there were no Ashkenazi Jews for whatever reason, it's hard for me to imagine that these college kids would care. I think they would see one Middle Eastern group fighting another, and it would be like the Syrian civil war to them. Even though it was Jews and Muslims, right? But what they see is a European group, and that activates the only philosophy that they have through which to see the world. So my question is, why do college kids care so much about this issue?
You're asking me why your college kids care so much about this issue?
Yeah.
We think you know everything.
No, guys, no. In my podcast, when Coleman comes onto my podcast, I will ask Coleman this question, and he will give me great wisdom. I have opinions. I don't have knowledge. You want an opinion?
Yeah. Tell us. Don't be shy. Come on.
From someone who is statistically a very mainstream, ordinary Israeli Jew. I think that you have created an academic and intellectual world. I include the American media, most of it, not all of it, obviously, that is a intellectual wasteland. And it is an intellectual just tundra, just empty place. And it is empty and deeply uncurious and convinced everything, it knows everything about everything, essentially because again, this is an extremely irresponsible thing for me to say because literally both of you know more than me about this. America is a nation whose fundamental understanding and lenses for understanding the world were religious. America has secularized in those age groups and in those sense-making elites, we'll call them, as people like to call them. And so we have been at ground zero observing the founding of a new religious, not so much ideology as aesthetic. It's a non-theological religion, but it is a religion that claims to explain everything with a simple vision. It's a religion whose only question is, how should I think morally about this? And not, first, how do I understand it analytically? Even the white part, if take white European Jews of Israel, they conflate them with American Jews and don't understand that American Jews and Ashkenazi Israeli Jews have had the opposite 20th century. American Jews didn't go through the 20th century because they lived in America and were saved by America. But in 1921, Congress closed America's doors with the Emergency Quota Act, and all the rest of the Jews that didn't make it in either died or became Israelis. So leave out for a second the Mizrachim. Just the Ashkenazim were literally the last living Jew in the Eastern Hemisphere. What the hell is an anti-Zionist? What's the argument? The argument is what? 7 more million Jews should be dead? We should never have survived? Say it out loud. Or is your argument that there should have been other places we could go when we were fleeing? I agree. There should have been other places. If that's anti-Zionism, is the argument that Jews should have had other options other than Zionism in the 20th century, I'm an anti-Zionist. If that's what anti-Zionism is, it's a goddamn shame that they didn't. Here's the thing. That's a complaint you can take to every human alive except the Israeli Jew. Because every human alive except the Israeli Jew didn't let the Israeli Jews go anywhere else. When America's doors were open, 95% of Jews fleeing Eastern Europe, fleeing 1,300 pogroms, 250,000 dead, fleeing decade after decade after decade of increasingly anti-Semitic laws, pushing Jews out of universities, out of professions, out of entire areas to live. Over those decades, 95% of them chose America. 3% chose other places, 2% became Zionist. It was when the doors shut to everywhere else on earth, America, Canada, Britain, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, France, who didn't pass a quota for immigration at the time. Canada's was 0, a flat 0. It's easy to remember. It's really convenient. Those are the Jews who became Israelis. So, the scale of ignorance, just profound ignorance, is shocking, and it has nothing. Nobody experiences their ignorance as somehow limiting their ability to decide whether I should live or die. In other words, in this progressive student campus imagination, there's a popularity contest underway, a moral popularity contest, where the one deemed less moral or immoral loses its legitimacy, which is a fascinating word to apply to a human society. What does it mean, right? Loses its right to what? Exist? Loses its right to what? It's an astonishing shrinking of the subject you are looking at into your own extraordinarily shallow moral cartoon. We're not just living through the birth of a new religion. We're living through the birth of the dumbest religion ever founded. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, when they were founded, went through processes of others and interpreting the world and understanding these kinds of moral equations, and they did it in 1,000 times more sophisticated and humane ways than this incredible ignorance that has just overwhelmed your campuses. I was on a bunch of campuses over the last 9 months on speaking tours, and I sometimes got to speak to protesters. Harvard Law, there was a really fun little protest in the middle of my talk. I enjoyed it very much. The last thing you want to be is the Israeli speaker on college campuses that doesn't get a protest anywhere, right? Because then, you're a nobody. And in my conversations with these protesters, what astonished me wasn't that they have strong opinions. The fact is, you should be worried about this war. You should be worried about all the wars. There are thousands of dead kids in Gaza. The numbers Hamas gives are totally made up. They pull them out of whole cloth. They just completely, they don't even pretend to count. But even the best case Israeli numbers The best case for Israel, the lowest possible death toll for Israel in this moral popularity contest, we're talking about 4,000 dead kids. In other words, there's no question that Gaza should be on the agenda. And it should be moral, and you should be skeptical, and you should come to Israel with demands. But they're amazingly uncurious people who are doing this. I come to them and I say to them, my complaint to you isn't that you're anti-Israel. I had this conversation with some New York Times people. It's that you're uncurious. Right? The part of Hamas that crossed the border on October 7 was trained, funded, and prepared for October 7 by Iran. Iran is a country that has no border with Israel and absolutely no interest in Israel. So why is it spending a double-digit percentage of its GDP on destroying Israel? Just as an analytical diagnostic question, explain. What? It's a huge thing happening in the world. Why is it happening? There is no curiosity, not among the students, not among the sense-making elites, not among the professors. It's an entire society built out, pretending to care about knowledge, but sacrificing that knowledge for moral uniformity, conformity, purity. I don't know what to call it. So I am much worse than, angry. I have written them off entirely. All of these students and all of their screaming. They're not curious about why Hamas would spend 17 years building those tunnels and why Hamas isn't more worried about Gazan civilian deaths than the Israelis. And why, Egypt, when we took the Philadelphia corridor, the Egyptian high command was very upset because a lot of the corrupt money that comes through Gaza from the Qataris gets to the Egyptian officers, and they didn't want us to stop their smuggling operations to Hamas. And so, they joined the genocide case of South Africa at the ICJ. Egypt didn't think there was a genocide until it was costing Egyptian officials cash. Then they thought there was a genocide. B, they shut down the Rafah border crossing to aid at a time when it was the main aid crossing. In other words, in the view of the Arab world, and nobody cared in the Middle East, to everyone this made sense, you punish Palestinians by limiting aid as a way of punishing these. How do you punish Israelis? By punishing Palestinians. Nobody is curious about these dynamics. Now, we might be monsters, okay? I constantly complain in Hebrew about Israel, where it matters. It doesn't so much matter in English. There's plenty of people doing it. But the uncuriosity to me is the heart of the matter. And so this isn't, your academia is no longer academic on these questions. It's no longer in academia. It's doing something else. There's some other function.
I was ask a quick follow-up there because you hit on something that you also addressed in one of your 2 lectures on YouTube, which are excellent, and I've been sending them around. One tells the story of Israeli Jews versus American Jews, and the second tells kind of the story of what Palestinians think Israeli Jews are and how that false model of Israeli Jews continually hampers their own project. And they're both so amazing. I've been, telling everyone to watch them. The first of those, you hit on this point that you just hit on, which is that for most, the Jews who populated Israel were by and large not doing so out of an ideology called Zionism, though many of them may have also shared affinity for that ideology. The primary reason was because they were refugees fleeing murderous violence with one place to go. If you're talking about after 1921, when the world closes its doors, that story of how Israel got populated is, I think, a lot more sympathetic to the Western world than the version which Israelis tell, which is that there's this guy Theodore Herzl who had this idea about Zionism, and then the idea caught fire, and you had all these people wanting to return home. That version of the story bumps up against the Western psyche, and everyone just thinks, well, people were already living there. You shouldn't have done that. But the story that you tell of essentially refugees with one place to go, I don't see how anyone can logically or morally disagree with that having been the right option at the time. So why don't Israelis and Jews more generally tell that version of the Zionist story?
That's a fascinating and
that's a good question.
Wonderful question. Yeah. First of all, we don't tell it to the rest of the world because we don't talk to the rest of the world about these things. One of the hearts and sort of the center of our DNA and understanding of history is the idea that we don't justify ourselves to the world. The world expressed its view on us. We stand up for ourselves, and the world can, purchase our high tech if it is so interested. And that is the relationship after the 20th century. We don't justify ourselves because in the mind that is watching us, that is observing us, that is making demands of us, we're a moral cartoon serving the needs of the cartoonist. And that is not a fight you can win. You can't walk into the anti-Semite's moral cartoon or, frankly, the progressive liberal gaze on us, which is just as dehumanizing and shrinking of our entire experience into these tiny little moral cubbyholes. And you can't win that debate. You cannot not be what they want you to be in their story of themselves. In the end, these are moral stories of themselves. And so you don't. The first point is cultural. The second point is, and this I think is the heart of it, elites. Elites are a huge problem everywhere. The real story of the founding of Israel is a social history of millions of desperate people. The elite stories there's a dozen of them, and they're all something else. So if you, for example, take Zionism, the word Zionism, right? If it has an adjective, it's fake. And what do I mean by fake? I mean my favorite people. I mean my parents and parents-in-law and wife all believe in one version of Zionism that I consider fake. They're okay with this. We've had these debates. I'm not throwing them under the bus or anything. But if you meet someone who is a religious Zionist, or you meet someone who's a liberal Zionist, or you meet someone who's a cultural Zionist, or a socialist Zionist, or a British aristocratic Zionist, there used to be those kinds. All these different Zionisms that have an adjective are different elites attempting to interpret the actual lived social history, the lived historical experience of millions of refugees. And so elites tell stories, and usually they're self-serving stories. And so all the versions of Zionism that get books written about them by elites are those versions of Zionism. So if you have a Peter Beinart who writes about his heart is torn asunder because the American liberal dream of Israel turns out to not be the perfect model society that they imagined it was in the 60s. Well, that's an elite, waking up to something not being convenient for a new generation of the same damn elite. None of it was real, not then, not now. And that's my personal view, why we don't tell that story, because too many elites are telling that story. The fact is, there is nothing else you should learn about Israel other than that refugee experience. And from that refugee experience, you can start to learn other things. For example, you want to talk about the Nakba. I'm doing all the talking. I apologize. My wife laughs at me that this is what happens when I meet polite people. On college campuses, there's this discourse about the Nakba, the disaster that is the 1948 displacement of Palestinians, that is the Palestinians, sort of the founding anchor of their story. And I want to talk about the Nakba because what Palestinians think will profoundly shape the future of my children. What college campus kids think in America won't. And so I want to talk about the Nakba more than they do. Here's the problem. The total death toll of the Nakba is about 8,000 dead, which is a tragedy and it's terrible. It's also the 1940s. With respect, the Palestinian official number is something like 13,000. Western historians generally count it something like 8,000. This is a tragedy and it's important, and the displacement is bigger than the death toll. But who are the soldiers of the IDF in 1948? The soldiers of the IDF are not just survivors. They're not just the children of these refugees. A quarter of the soldiers of the IDF in 1948 are DPs. Who are DPs? DPs are people liberated from the camps, from Buchenwald and Dachau and Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and all the rest, and a year after the war are still on German soil in camps, and this time patrolled by the American and British armies. And Truman begs Congress to let down the quotas. There are no more 10 million East European Jews who could flood America's shores. There's this tiny, shrunken remnant suffering typhoid epidemics in the wake of the war after liberation. It's nothing. It's not even 250,000 people. And Congress won't let them in. And 40 governments come to the DP camps. It's in the framework of the International Refugee Organization in 1946. And they interview all the DPs to take them and give them jobs essentially, and they take all the 400,000 Nazi collaborators from the Baltics, and they take all the Polish Catholics, something like 750,000 DPs in the immediate aftermath of the war that they all take, and they all get naturalization, they all get citizenship out there in the West. And by 1946, the end of the year, all the 250,000 DPs left, every last one is a Jew. And there's one thing those Jews know. Now that the world has seen Auschwitz, we still have nowhere to go. Those DPs are a quarter of the IDF in 1948. They don't know anything, but they know one thing. If they don't have this place, they don't have any place. Now, if we're talking about the social history of that event, I am absolutely sure my country has done things wrong. And if I were to tell you, Noam and Coleman, that your country has done things wrong, you would not fall off a chair. That is not a shock to you. I'm an actual Israeli. I'm not engaged in the moral popularity contest. I think that's kind of a pathetic thing to be running in your head about the rest of the world. But if you don't know the basic social history of real people and their lived experience of the millions, you will not understand anything happening. There's even polls of these people, of the Israelis of 1948, about the fleeing Palestinian refugees. And these polls by the Haganah, Derek Penzlar of Harvard put me onto these polls. I didn't know about them before. This is not knowledge that is impossible to acquire. We just have to put it together. There was a lot of sympathy. And also the one crystal clear understanding that we need this place or we die. So I forgot the question, but my point is that no, elites are a problem because elites tell histories that are not the deeper histories. What ordinary people think will tell you more about historical developments and directions than any elite version from any academic or journalistic group. Anything that they try to sell you.
And by the way, when Coleman asked that question and he asked, why don't the Israelis do a better job explaining? My first thought was, why don't the American Jews do a better job explaining this? And I think, and then you hit on one of my answers is they become elite. And the other answer, unfortunately, is that they actually don't even know the facts any longer. They don't even know, I've said this many times, if I meet a young Jewish person and I ask them, do you know how it is that the occupied territories became occupied? They have no idea. Like the basic ABCs of the Arab-Israeli conflict are unknown to, I would speculate, 85% of American Jews. So
no, American Jews willfully disarmed themselves of their own story and now face a frontal assault on their story and don't understand why they're so weak. The 1,300 pogroms that drove millions of penniless Jews with nothing but the shirts on their backs to New York Harbor over the course of the last 20 years of the 19th century and first 20 years of the 20th are the story of American Jewry coming into being. And the only thing left in American Jewish memory of that experience of the hundreds of thousands of dead and the millions of fleeing is Fiddler. There's nothing left.
You know, it just occurred to me the first time, Coleman will like this. You know how it's become very, very important for black people, and then liberal people agree with this argument. You need to know your history. We need to teach black people their history. If you don't know your history, you don't know anything. And Jews don't know their history much more profoundly than blacks don't know their history. American Jews have no idea of, and it's recent history, and they don't know it. It's their grandparents' history. And my grandparents, they don't know anything about it. And from that, they have no basis to defend themselves. So they're vulnerable to the arguments, emotional arguments of the other side. Then they lose their nerve. They see Israel as not really a real country. And all the kind of arguments, well, how would you expect America to react in the same situation? These don't really move them because America's a real country. Israel in their mind somehow is not. So it's apples and oranges to them. All right, just a few quick things. There's some arguments of the mainstay arguments of the anti-Israeli position that I just want to get your kind of quick takes on.
Okay.
Netanyahu propped up Hamas. Is it true? And if he hadn't propped up Hamas, what would be different?
It is a oversimplification of a complex Israeli policy problem. Netanyahu had an argument, and it was a smart argument. The argument was, we can't socially engineer them. We can't get rid of Hamas. What is left to us is to contain them and live our happy lives separate from them. Since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, that's 17 years now, Israel's GDP per capita doubled. We are now slightly wealthier than New Zealand per capita. Hamas, and like Hamas, pretty much all of our enemies, Hezbollah and the entire Iranian proxy system, essentially demolish their own societies because of the nature of the organizations and the nature of their ideologies. They are tyrannical, theocratic ideologues who destroy themselves. And so the argument essentially was, time is on our side. We have fundamental strengths. We have basically good policies, and we go from strength to strength. The gap between us and our enemies grows, technological gap, military gap, economic gap, and so contain, deter, and sit tight. And if politics change on the other side, and we won't get another second intifada for another peace process, let that argument be made. But nobody questions that under Hamas that didn't happen. Nobody in Israel. And so that was the argument. And it was a very smart argument, and most Israelis agreed with it, and most Israelis on the left agreed with it. It was an argument to avoid the kind of war that the far right was calling for in Israel and Gaza to remove Hamas every time rockets fell. And once, in one particular faction meeting, when Netanyahu was having trouble from far right voters because there were rockets falling and he looked weak because he was making this kind of an argument, he said, "What do you think, I'm an idiot?" I'm paraphrasing. By allowing the Qataris to stabilize Hamas in Gaza, we prevent the Palestinians from unifying their factions, and that helps us everywhere. This is a far-right but clever policy. That is Netanyahu classic, that's classic Netanyahu. It is not the reason for the policy, but he pretended it was when that's what he needed politically. Netanyahu's governments over the last 13, 14 years have been the biggest investors in the Arab community, corrected for inflation in the history of Israel. In education, and there was a negative income tax for Arab working women that he personally helped advance. And then when he campaigned in the last 5 elections over the last 6, 7 years, he ran explicit anti-Arab campaigns. Now, there's a debate in Israel. Is he racist, or is he pretending to be racist for politics? I fall profoundly on the side of he's pretending to be anti-Arab for politics, because in hard policy he wasn't, ever, until he needed to be to scrape out the last 2% on the right, because it was such a narrow race. I think that's morally worse than to be actual Europe. That's your actual opinion. But irrespective of whether it's worse or not worse, Netanyahu has policies and then sells those policies, and those are very different things. No, Netanyahu didn't prop up Hamas, and also, by the way, Netanyahu is not the reason Hamas and Fatah can't unite. Fatah is the conservative Sunni faction of Palestine. Hamas is the radical Salafist Sunni faction of Palestine. One gets all the support of one half of the Arab Sunni world, and one gets all the support of the other half. And, ne'er the twain shall meet. Literally, all of their patronage and all of their money and all of their support on the world stage comes from opposed halves in the great Middle Eastern civil war. So they can't unite because of such vast, vast pressures that have nothing to do with Netanyahu.
Ami Ayalon has said, if we shall not end the occupation, we shall not have security. And if we shall not end this occupation, we shall not have democracy. Is he right? And if he is right, what are his policy recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, in the West Bank, Palestinians do not live in democracy. Israel is a democracy. Democracies can do undemocratic things. Democracies can have undemocratic spaces. Democracies can have failures. Democracies can have deeply confused traps that they don't know how to get out of. That is not unique to Israel. That is, a lot of brilliant Americans have argued essentially this argument that there is a lot wrong with America, but there is a lot right with America that can fix over time what is wrong with America. I don't think there's a democracy in the West Bank for Palestinians, obviously. But will that destroy Israeli democracy? I don't know how to, I don't understand how the process would work. I don't think Israeli democracy will fall because of the West Bank occupation. I don't think Israel will fall because of the West Bank occupation. What I do think is the Israeli left, shattered by the Second Intifada, no longer really able to explain to us the end of your question. How? What? What do I do? I am asked by, for example, Columbia University activist students, by the way, driven to that argument by Palestinian elites at Columbia. In other words, Palestinian diaspora elites like Rashid Khalidi or Noura Erikad, or, this is a Palestinian construct in some ways, at least an elite one of a particular Palestinian elite. I am told that if I don't pull out of the West Bank, they're going to squeeze me and pressure me and make me ostracized and sad. And Hamas tells me that everywhere I pull out of, they're going to murder my children from that place. Watch me. Now, they don't understand, because of the profound ignorance that underlies this movement and the dehumanizing shrinking of me into this cartoon, that they're debating each other in my head. And Hamas is louder. So what do I do? And how do I... If the West Bank shrinks me down to 9 miles wide in the middle of the country. The West Bank, I can, with a weapon you can carry on your shoulder, not even a heavy one, an 88 millimeter mortar, for example. You can shut down my one international airport and most of my major cities, and then walk away on foot. The West Bank is a spectacular danger for Israel. It is the highlands overlooking the entire coastal plain where the vast majority of Israelis live. I can pull out of the West Bank if it is safe. Nobody knows how to make it safe. I have had at least 2 elections where Israelis knowingly have voted for it. And it ended in terrible, terrible bloodshed. So what Israelis, and again, what I just described is the Israeli historical experience of the mainstream of Israeli Jews. There are other experiences, other interpretations among Jews, among Arabs. You don't have to agree with that. This is objective history that I just delivered. But it is what most Israeli Jews think happened to them. And if you don't address that, you're not going to make a dent for Palestinians. I need to know how. Ami Ayalon's morals are in the right place. His patriotism is unquestionable. He's the former head of the Navy and of the Shabak, and he's a very great Israeli. He knows more about the West Bank and the Middle East than I do. He refuses,
and he knows the dark side of Israeli behavior too, which I think weighs on him in some way.
I agree completely, and it should weigh on us. We're Israelis, and we make terrible mistakes sometimes. But he needs to tell us how, because if he doesn't tell us how, he's not explaining to us how he's not making the dent he thinks he's making.
Last one. You have one more? We don't want to keep it. We might have to have the trump card that the anti-Israeli people have is the settlement issue. I don't know what to answer when it comes to the settlements. I'm embarrassed by the settlements, given what I know about them. What do you answer to people when they throw the settlements at Israel?
I mean, I don't want to take away people's judgment, what they think they think. I can tell you what most Israelis think. Most Israelis distinguish between several different kinds of settlements. And 2 of the, let's say, 3 kinds are not an obstacle to peace, and the Israelis don't care about them. The vast majority of settlers live within 3,000 to 5,000 feet of the Green Line. I mean, the 2 biggest settlements, there are, let's say, 130 settlements. These things, that's the way they're kind of counted. Out of those 130, exactly 2 of them contain a quarter of all Israelis living over the Green Line. And they're both vast and incredibly young Haredi, ultra-Orthodox cities. And they're both within 2,000 feet of the Green Line. And so are they a problem for peace? We can't just exchange a couple of square kilometers in the north of the Gilboa area or in the south, or, that most Israelis sort of write that off. Some of the settlement stuff Israelis in principle don't care about. I mean, just are deeply opposed to the idea that it's a settlement. For example, the Kotel is a settlement. The Western Wall is, by the international reckoning of the ceasefire line of 1949, which is how this thing is decided, a settlement. Well, if the holiest place in Judaism is a settlement, you can go jump in a lake, dear world, right? If you visit the old city of Jerusalem, which I urge everyone on earth to do, and talk to Palestinians there, not just the Jews. When you visit the old city of Jerusalem, you'll see something astonishing. The Jewish quarter is much more beautiful than the Muslim, Armenian, or Christian quarters. Not beautiful in the sense that there's ancient wonders in all the other quarters. But the Jewish quarter is very spacious. There's public Wi-Fi. There's good plumbing. There are new buildings. Why? Because when the Jordanians ruled Jerusalem for 19 years, they demolished everything in the Jewish quarter, including medieval synagogues. So I don't care if you think it's a settlement. Nothing Jewish will survive if Israel abandons it. So I'm going to hold on to the old city or the Temple Mount.
Only because I'm worried about your time. I want to the bad stuff where the settlers stomp on olive trees and
Probably a quarter of the settlement movement is an ideological religious movement that intentionally placed dozens of specific locations in between Palestinian population centers to prevent the formation of a Palestinian state. And I think that a lot of what happens there is very troubling. I'm a little bit of a secret lefty. Don't tell anybody. My name is signed on a Supreme Court petition against, an attempt to oust one particular Bedouin village in the West Bank. I mean, my dad was the chairman of Rabbis for Human Rights. I'm sitting here showing my left-wing credentials. Just to say, it's not that I disagree. It's that it's much more. If I tell you who I vote for, I'll be telling you the single least interesting thing to tell you. But what most Israelis understand is that there are pieces of the settlement movement that hamper a possible deal. Not that they need to think a deal is possible to worry about that, but those who do think a deal is possible make this distinction as well. And there's huge amounts, most of the settlement movement that does not, and some of it that is just not, they're not willing to give up no matter what the world thinks. And so there are these distinctions, there are these gradations. If the world doesn't see those gradations, it's going to have trouble talking to Israelis. And if the world focuses on that problem, there are actually violent, radical, deeply racist sections of that religious settlement movement that I don't think is a majority of the very far-right religious part of that religious movement, but nevertheless it is big enough. If it's a few hundred people, it's a few hundred people that for political reasons is very hard to crack down on and have terribly embarrassed and shamed Israel. And by the way, attack the Israeli army routinely. And even talk about attacking Palestinians as a way to get back at a left-wing Israel that they feel has betrayed them. And so it's this group that is deeply unhealthy, deeply violent, and I think any blame leveled at our government for failing to crack down on them is totally legitimate blame. By the way, for Palestinians, just to say, this is really also important, for Palestinians, settlements are the great signal of Israeli intention. In other words, we Israelis have been sort of testing Palestinian intentions for 30 years and concluded that they don't intend us well and can't sign a peace deal. Palestinians have that same narrative arc, but they point to settlements. And they say, you talk and talk and talk, you keep voting for peace, blah, blah, blah. Not always, but certainly quite a few times, except settlements. So that's how I know it's all a lie from your end. And so it's a huge question.
And that's not a crazy interpretation on their part.
I don't think there are any crazy. I don't think Hamas are crazy. Everybody is a serious, thoughtful person.